let's move along for the next one. Now we're gonna go to the 3-thread rolled edge, and only change from the previous stitch is we're gonna put the stitch selector to D. That's all we have to do, because we still have to have our stitch length on the rolled hem side. The stitch width is recommended at 3.5. However, I do use some of the other ones also. That is just the most common, and I do use that setting when I do normal rolled hem. But later on I have some samples that I do change that one too. But really the most important is the stitch selector to D. And here's probably the most common use for the rolled edge stitch. Finishing edges of a light to medium weight fabrics. And it's kind of important that we don't try to do a rolled edge on a thick, heavy fabric, because the fabric will be fighting back and doesn't really roll nicely. I have a little section what I also saw in a live demo that I had the leftover piece on a little ruffle that I had made on the little girl's clothing. So I had searched both edges on the fabric strip, and then I had used just the ruffle foot in my sewing machine to gather this little ruffle. There's another picture that is a little corners of the napkins that I had used gold metallic embroidery thread in my upper looper. Because on this stitch, the thread that shows the most is your upper looper. So that's where I typically put a little bit heavier thread. And on this one, I will also demonstrate how we're gonna use those fuzzy woolly nylon type of threads. So I use the poly yarn, which is the polyester version on that thread. And one thing to point out, and I do mention that on my machine demonstration also, that sometimes you get on some of the sides on a woven fabric, you may get little hiccups when the other side looks perfect. Well, that is to do with the weave and the weft of the fabric. It's just the fibers are different on the cross versus the with direction on the different cranes. So that is why sometimes you may see a little hiccups. I just usually run my fingers between and you can smooth them out. But that's a question I do get very often. And I have my settings what I'll be using in a sample. One of the things I normally do is that I put my differential feet to 0.8, especially when using these threads. That way it will gonna keep my fabric more taut underneath the foot when I'm stitching. And I just use a single layer, and you need to remember to put the right side up. And I always trim a little bit while I'm searching on that edge.
Okay. The next, I will have several techniques using the rolled edge stitch. So it was quite a bit similar to the narrow hem. Only difference is that on this stitch, the upper looper gets wrapped around over the wrong side and the underside also. It's a great edge finish for ruffles, and also it's a great edge finish for napkins. Anytime I have a single layer of fabric. If I have more than, like I have a double layer, then you may want to use the overlock narrow hem, makes a little bit prettier look. Also, if your fabric is really stiff, this stitch doesn't make it so very pretty because the fabric just can't roll over. So upholstery fabric, no, wouldn't be very pretty. I'm gonna be sewing just a little strip of just a quilting cotton fabric, but I have some other samples that I had done, leftover pieces that I had used as a ruffle. So I had put the woolly nylon on my upper looper, because on this stitch, the thread that shows the most is the upper looper. Needle thread, I just used only Serger thread, and the lower looper ends up being a wheelie, just almost a straight stitch underneath. So I used also the all-purpose Serger thread for that one. So here's the same thread used on a different fabric. So this is also why I'm going to show how do we use the woolly nylon or these stretchy type of threads. This one is a polyester version of the woolly nylon. It's a kind of generic name is like a texturized nylon or texturized polyester. This one doesn't have as much stress as a woolly nylon has, but this one is made out of polyester, so it's a bit more heat resistant. So if I do napkins, I can put the hot iron on top of it. If I use the woolly nylon, it has a lower melting point. Woolly nylon comes also on a woolly nylon extra, which is really, really thick. So it gives a good coverage and it has a lots of give. other kind of similar stretchy threads. This is one of my favorites, Snazzy Lock. It is a metallic stretchy thread. It's a great edge finish also. Has a little bit give on it, and it comes on all kinds of colors, and we have them in the shop. Well, how would I thread these ones? Because these threads, they are just so fuzzy and they're so lightweight, there's nothing for the air to take. So let me go and open the covers. And I just have to remind myself, go through the checklist first and then thread the machine. So happened that on this stitch, the threading is exactly the same. So really from the overlock narrow hem and rolled edge, the threads go always in the same spot. So I would have been okay, but always a good rule, go through the checklist first. So compared for the last stitch, yep, with the same needle position, and also the length, we have the entire range, but we had to be in the rolled hem side. A stitch width, most times we use the 3.5. I'm gonna put it in here, the 3.5, where the letter M is. That for the Anno Mr. Merrow. And then the stitch selector. Now we're gonna go to D. So that is important. We went from C to D. Rest of the settings are the same on as my previous stitch. So really all I had to change was the stitch selector. And then I'm gonna get my fuzzy thread onto that upper looper. So I lift my pressure foot up. And as always, I will click the thread from the top, take that spool out, and then I will put my fuzzy thread up in the antenna. There we go. And let me pull that thread out. Again, we do not want to do any knots on it. You may be tempted to knot this one, but we don't want to do knots. They can get caught inside the tubes. And as I mentioned earlier, really hard to clean out. So let's just use the methods we have. So no knots. So I'm going to snap the thread on my upper looper position, put my machine to searching, rotate the hand wheel, and then I will use that lasso trick on this one, because this thread, I can't really get it through the eye of the loop, and I lost my previous thread, so I'll take a new one from here. Again, I will need to take just the length of the thread. I will take the 2 open ends. I often think that I'll save the old one and then I'll lose it and end up using another piece. Well, such a thread is really inexpensive, so no need for me to worry about a piece of thread. Again, I'll take those 2 thread tails, make sure that they're clean finish, put those 2 tails onto the threading ports, and I don't want to spit on it. I just twisted them a bit with my fingers. Hold on this other end with the loop, pull the thread, and my threads start to come out. If I did not hold on this other end, my thread most likely would have gone all the way past. So now I can take my fuzzy thread, put it just a little bit, at least about an inch or 2 on that loop, and then I can pull the thread through, give me a little bit more slack, and here it comes. Here is my looper thread. Can be in a heavier thread, I just put it underneath the pressure foot, so I can close my levers. Well, this time, because I'm using that stretchy thread, what I'm going to do is I will shorten my stitch length, but also I'm going to make sure that my differential feed is 0.8. I could go even 0.6, but 0.8 gives my fabric taut, because that very stretchy thread can easily pull my fabric when it relaxes. So I'm going to go in a stitch length knob, and the first notch after the 0, so it really is 0.75. And I always trim a little bit, because it's a very narrow seam, so if I don't trim any of it, I may not catch the edge. I may be wandering off a little bit. So I usually trim a little bit. If nothing else, these kind of a loosely raveled edges there. So let me go ahead and search this seam. This will take a little while to go because the stitch length is very, very short. And one of the things on this stretchy thread, sometimes this tail, because it's kind of stretchy, it may want to flip over. So I'm just going to put my hand behind to make sure that it doesn't flip over. There we go. is my seam, and sometimes you may get those little bumps on or showing through. Well, that's just because the fabric is trying to roll over. Usually when you just run your fingers through it, that kind of smooths it out. I had a very short stitch length, so I got really nice coverage on my edge. But sometimes what I do, I may even put 2 of those strands, or then I could use this woolly nylon extra if I want to have it even more coverage. I have also used some of these heavier threads. Then you want to have your stitch length about maybe 1.5, but they give very nice rolled edge finish also. So that was a great way to do ruffles or napkins. Well, then the question is, how would I corner corners over on a napkin? One option is that I could try to pivot at the corners, like I had done on this one. Or other option is that you just go off the edge, just kind of when I went over this one, and then come back, and then put a seam sealant on that corner, let it dry, and trim it. That will work perfectly also. If you do the pivoting at the corners, little tip is that then I wouldn't really trim anything off, just those little whiskers. If you do a little corner cut, because whenever I'm doing a rolled hem, let me use this other side that I didn't cut. On this one, when I have the fabric rolled this way and that way, it'll make it very bulky. It's kind of hard to make it really pretty corner. But if I take that little piece of fabric out, makes it a little bit tighter, nicer corner. So let me show that corner. I just go through off the edge. But here's a little trick also that depending on the foot, this foot with my Triumph is flat on the bottom. Several other feet, we have a little pump in here where this rolled edge can get caught. So on those ones, as kind of a watch, and just to kind of maybe just to help it a little bit to go over that bump. But the flat foot just goes through. The 4-thread sergers, you can also purchase a separate flat foot that will help for that one. So let me just go at the corner and show you how you can pivot the corner. Then the thread tail wants to kind of flip easily over, so I'm going to hold it behind in there. I'm not really pulling, I'm just going to holding it flat. Sometimes that pump of the thread, pump of that fabric is then harder to get started. There we go. So now I'm going to just to go right at the corner. So just really skimming the edge of the fabric. And now I'm at the corner, so I will do my pivoting. I will lift the needle up, press the foot up, give a little tug, pull the fabric back like we did on the first class, and then I'm going to line up this new cut edge right against my knife blade, pull that slack or the thread back that I pulled, I loosened. I'm going to lower my needle down at the edge of the fabric and then continue stitching. And I'll just go off in here. Don't need to see me go all the way there. But here's my pivoting at the corner. I had a little piece of a fabric still sewing. I could put a little seam sealant or just clip that piece of fabric from that corner. So I got pretty nice corner on this one. On this side, I would put seam sealant, let it dry and clip it. One thing you most likely notice that if you have a woven fabric, that 2 sides, the seam look prettier than the other 2. That's to do with the weave and the weft of the fabric. Because the fibers that are going through the machine direction, those ones are stronger, so they don't bend as easy. So you normally see prettier looking stitches on the 2 directions on the fabric than the other 2. So that's just the nature of the fabric. So here was my rolled hem.
Well, isn't that pretty? Just another variation of the rolled edge stitch, but this time sewn on the stretchier side of a knit fabric. So the bottom one is a sample that I had made for a little baby bonnet, and I will show you the actual bonnet also. And on this one I had used in the upper looper the heavier kind of woolly nylon type of thread. Really the heavier thread and a very short stitch length worked the best. I'll be showing the demo when I do this one. And on this sample, I actually put 2 strands of the poly yarn, because the poly yarn is a little bit thinner than the poly nylon. So I put 2 strands of it into my upper loop at the same time. And then I got a really nice stitching. I'll be doing this sample a little bit different than the manual has. Most times, most instructions tell you to put the differential feed to all the way to 0.6. But then you run in a chance that your fabric edge may get pulled out from the needle area a little bit, and your stitches may not look as pretty. That is one reason why we're making the stitch width a little bit wider, not that 3.5 like the quick reference guide showed us. And the important is we need to sew it on the stretchy side of the fabric. If I sewed it in the other direction, I won't get much of a waviness. And the trick on this one is really, don't worry if it doesn't first look wavy. We just gonna, in the end, take the piece of fabric and just gonna run our fingers through that stitching, and it will stretch the seam, and this will stay there permanently, because I have a t-shirt that I have done on that edge, and that t-shirt is very old, and those stitches always stayed that way.
Okay, well, the next roll hem technique that I have is lettuce edge. And there's a little baby bonnet that I've used as the knit fabric and sewn a little lettuce edge on this top edge. In the back, it is part of the casing, and the ribbon will tie it together. Use the same kind of rosettes on the side. This fabric is 100% cotton, so I got really nice edges on that one. And I did the test originally. So here's my rolled edge. Using that heavier thread, I used the woolly nylon or poly yarn, and I think I used 2 strands. So actually on my machine, I threaded 2 strands of that thread, because it gives a better look when you have a heavier stitch in there. I did my first test using ordinary Serger thread, and it just did not look pretty at all. So the heavier thread makes it just prettier. Actually, the t-shirt I have, let's see if I can show the sleeve a little bit. That one I used really thick thread, and I had just to make that lettuce edge, and this is very old t-shirt. Well, now depending on the thread that we are using, the thread and fabric, some fabrics we don't get as much waviness. This one on this what I have, this one is polyester, so I didn't get as pretty waviness on that one. So here's another baby bonnet that I had done out of fabric that was 95% cotton, but 5% lycra. So see how the lycra was kind of affecting quite a bit on the look on that lettuce edge. This way done the same way, but it's just a different look because of the different fabrics. The technique could also be done on a woven fabric on a bias. So you may get a little bit of a waviness with the heavy thread on the cutting on a bias. This little scarf that I had made. Then I tried it on chiffon, and that just didn't look good at all. So again, do a test to see which one would work. I have another trick for you doing it on that chiffon. In order to do that lettuce edge look, we need to have a cotton fabric, preferably 100% cotton, but it needs to be on that stretchier side. We won't get much of a lettuce edge on this double knit going this way, but this edge we can do pretty good. I have my stitch length to shortest, and I have my stitch width at a 3.5. You could have it a little bit wider. I may actually go to 4.5, make a little bit wider seam on this one. I put my differential feed only to 0.8. I think the manual tells to use it 0.6, and then I think they even tell you to stretch it ahead time. You could do that one too, but on my multiple and licensing class, I was told that you get better looks if you just let it go even as it is. Because what happens if I make my differential feed really big, really small, I should say 0.6, then my fabric gets stretched underneath the foot. And what happens, that edge will kind of go away from the needle. So I may not catch the edge as well. That is the reason that making the stitch with a bit wider helps to catching it. But most times I just put it 0.8, and that works good. Otherwise I have my roll hem stitch. I have the heavier thread in the upper loop and Serger thread in the middle and the lower loop. And I always trim a little bit while I'm stitching. Again, that little curly thread wants to come back, so I'm just gonna hold a bit. There we go. It already starts stretching quite a bit. Again, every knit behaves a little bit different. At the moment, this doesn't really look much of a lettuce leaf, but here's the trick. I will just take this between my fingers and pull it, and it turns into a really nice lettuce edge. And it will stay this way because the t-shirt I have, it's been washed and worn many times. I only have to do that at one time, and I got really nice lettuce edge look for that one. So I didn't need to stretch it inside the machine, I just stretch it afterwards.
Well, could I get similar kind of a lettuce edge look on a woven fabric? Not really exactly, because the woven fabric, even though on a cotton bias, will have a little bit stretchiness, but without any extra help, that edge wouldn't really become very wavy. On this sample that I have, quilting cotton, there is a fishing line, and I used a bit heavier fishing line on this one. But there's a little fishing line inside the stitching that keeps that edge that way. I will be showing this sample where I'm stitching on a bridal tulle or netting, and I have a little bit thinner fishing line going inside of that stitching. And that will just give us a really nice curly edge because the tulle is a very stretchy fabric. But also maybe organdy or some of those lighter weight fabrics would work pretty well also. Well, how do we get the fishing line inside there? We're gonna be using the elastic foot. Sounds a bit that elastic foot, but that is a multi-purpose foot. There's a place for little fishing line or any other kind of extra line that we might want to put into it.
Okay. Well, the next one I wanted to show how could I have made lettuce edge on that woven fabric, or which you may see it on a bridal tulle or maybe on a chiffon. These ones are kind of stretchy. This is a very, very lightweight tulle. So I would get some amount of lettuce leaf look on already, but here's the trick. If I use fishing line inside the edge, that will help. Well, how do I keep this fishing line inside the stitch? Because it's a very narrow stitch. I would have to keep it between my knife and my needle. Kind of tricky. Well, we have a help for that one. Elastic foot. Kind of sounds a bit elastic foot for wire. But elastic foot is a two-purpose foot. We have two holes. And it's always easier to put that fishing line through that hole first. And this is about 12-pound test fishing line. So that'll work pretty well. And I leave a little tail because many times when I put this on here first, and by the time I put my foot in the machine, I have pulled my fishing line out. So let me get my standard foot, and I'm holding that wire bit, and then I will get the foot underneath, snap it in place, and then I'm gonna just hold this edge. This is where I like to use my knee lever to drop my pressure foot down. And I always like to do just a couple stitches, make sure that I have caught that fishing line inside the stitch so that my needle goes to the left of the fishing line. And I'm still using the rolled hem stitch. And let me put my little tool, it's almost barely see-through. And I'm not going to hold on to the fishing line, I'm just going to let it be, but just to have the foot to take care of it. That little tail wants to flip over, so always when you have this stretchy thread, just kind of watch that little tail in the beginning because it wants to kind of pull over a bit. After I get it going, I'll be okay. See, I don't need to kite this wire, all I have to do is to kite the fabric. I'm going to cut, but I'm going to leave a bit of a tail when I cut that edge on that my fishing line. And then instead of me sewing all the way through this one, let me just lift my needles up. And then I will want to get this pulled through, but it's kind of stuck at the moment. Well, here's that little trick that I mentioned, I think, one point, that there is a time that we can use the hand wheel backwards, normally always towards. But now that I have my needle up, my pressure foot up, if I go my hand wheel just half a turn, just enough to put my needle down, but I turn it backwards, just like this. And now when I pull my thread tails, it releases it more from the loopers, and I'll be able to pull those threads out, and then I can cut my threads. So that's the only time that we really want to go backwards in the search. So now I'm going back forward on that one. So now I have that little fishing line inside that stretchy fabric, or this very lightweight fabric. But if I give a little bit of a pull from center out, I get really nice curvy edges. I really got a lot of curvy edges on this one. So the fishing line just keeps that a shape on this very lightweight bridal tulle or netting or chiffon. So I used the rolled hem stitch, but using that fishing line was a little extra trick in there. On this sample, I had used really thick fishing line, and I used just a bias cut edge over normal quilting weight cotton, and I got some of the wavy look on that one too.
Well, if you can put the fishing line onto that foot, we ought to be able to also put a wire, a little craft wire. And that's exactly what I have done with these little samples. I put a thin, about approximately 30 gauge, 28, 30 gauge craft wire into that same place on this elastic foot. And then I stitch a rolled edge, stitch around on the both sides of this batik. That way, when I made the bow, I was able to just to shape those edges. In this little flower, I only serged one side with the rolled edge with the wire inside. Other side I gathered and then just to turn it into a flower. And yes, this is all done in a serger, and this is all wire edges around this little pansy and the leaf. And the little white piece of fabric, that's the one I'll be demonstrating. So only big note I put in this one is do not use wire cutters. So you do use wire cutters. Do not use the serger knives to cut the wire. No metal for the serger knife.
Well, if we can do fishing line in the machine, what about a craft wire? Sure, we can put the craft wire there also. This one I just had cut a strip of batik and sewed a rolled hem edge on the both sides with a little bit of a craft wire inside. The batik, so solid fabrics, gives us really nice wire edge ribbons because both sides are pretty. And I had used that really thick pearl crown cotton, so I had lengthened my stitch length about 2 on this one. But now my wire is inside and I can shape this bow as I like to. If I only put the wire on one side and gather the other side, tie them into a little rosette, and here I have a flower that I can shape those edges. Then I sometimes really like to play, so there's a little pansy and a leaf all done in a serger, other than a little hand sewing just to put those pieces together, and I might fancy pin holder, a little pin to hold, put it on a garment. But this one is all with the rolled hem and a wire inside on this one. So yep, we can do that one also. So I'm going to use the same foot as I did before. Again, I'm taking the foot out, and then let me put a little bit of a wire. The wire that you want to use, like a 30 gauge, 28 gauge, those are great. Just need to make sure that you keep the wire away from the knife. We don't want to use the knife to cut it. We use the wire cutters or old scissors to do that one. So I'm going to weave that wire the same way through that my elastic foot. And if I put a little loop behind so that I don't accidentally pull it out. Now that I have a wire in it, I'll take a little bit more care. So I'm going to manually rotate my hand wheel to make sure that I do couple stitches onto that over the wire, so that my needle goes to the left side of the wire. And let me get a little bit more slack. And I have just a strip of fabric. I lengthen the stitch length a bit so it goes a bit faster. So I'll be just gonna barely trimming off from this piece of fabric, and I just think I put it the wrong side up. Can't really tell too much on this white fabric. And I'm still using the same rolled hem stitch as I did before. Again, I'm just making sure that that little tail doesn't flip over. There we go. See, I don't need to guide the wire. All I do is I'm guiding the fabric. And I'm just barely trimming off a little bit of the edge. And if I want to go to other side, so here is my wire. Let me go a bit longer. And then I can just flip this one underneath to do the other side also. I kind of maybe wouldn't want to have it much thinner than the width of the foot, because then the foot kind of binds a bit, but this was about 1 inch wide strip of fabric, so I think that worked pretty good. And I'm approaching, so I'm gonna get the old scissors and clip the wire. You don't want to use your good fabric scissors or the knife in a Serger for that one. Wire cutters are the best. Then I'm just going to go, and again I can do the same trick as I did before. I lift my needle up, press the foot up, and then I rotate my hand wheel backwards, so that just a half a turn, needle down, so I can pull the thread towards back. And now I have my thread so that I can clip the threads and not cut the wire. So here is my rolled hem over wire, which I can shape any way I'd like to have it. So another great technique.
Well, what else could be used at a 3-thread rolled edge? Well, this one I'm creating my own piping. Yes, we can do also a fabric piping in the Serger, and we'll be doing that on a number 3 class. But this one is a piping made out of thread. And the little corner you'll see here is from the little wine bottle bag that we had done in one of the Serger clubs. And this wire, or this little metallic piece what you see, that is done by serging a 3-thread rolled edge on a piece of a no-show mesh stabilizer. All I needed was something lightweight, some material that wouldn't shred, and the little scrap of the no-show mesh works perfectly. And I just saw the rolled edge, and I used this really thick number 4 cotton thread. And because my spool was getting quite empty, I used the thread director that kind of had that spool to spin on it. And in the end, then I took my piping ruler and started to trim it off. So that way I'll have the perfect little piping. Doesn't add much bulk because this is very thin, so it doesn't add any extra bulk onto that edge of the fabric. So yes, we can make our own piping also.
Well, what else could we use with pretty thread and rolled hem stitch? Well, on this little bag, little wine bag or gift bag, the piping may look like a piping, but it actually is a thread piping. It's made out of using a pretty thread in an upper looper and a rolled hem stitch. And the fabric I used inside in there is just a stabilizer. It's a no-show mesh stabilizer, a little scrap piece of it. But putting the pretty thread in an upper looper, we can make our own piping that we can then insert between 2 layers, and it looks like we have a really decorative, pretty piping. So here's just a little sample of the leftover from this one. So how would I use this one? Well, I have set on my machine that really thick thread, so I bypass my threading bar tubes, and I use also the thread director for that one. So again, I'm just going to do a couple stitches by hand, make sure that that heavy thread starts going okay, and then I lengthen my stitch length to 2. I'm not catching it at the moment. There we go. Now it started. Anytime I sew with these really heavy threads, I always try to not to go the full speed. Here we go. Here we have a pretty piping, just out of using the thread. And then I would use my piping ruler to trim the excess, and then I can either use a sewing machine or serger to insert that between 2 layers of fabric. And here we have a thread piping.
Well, here's another technique. Just to search an edge on a really lightweight sheer, loosely woven fabric like chiffon, which is sometimes a bit challenging. On this little sample that I'll show also on my live video, when I searched the edge with the really kind of a dense short stitch length, my stitch started to pull off the edge of the fabric. So in this case, really the best option would be to lengthen the stitch length a little bit, which is this scarf that I had made long time ago. Because originally when I made this scarf, I had used very short stitch length and I put woolly nylon in the upper looper. So I was happily stitching, and then when I looked behind the machine to see how the stitch looked like, I had a stitch and I had a scarf, but they were no longer together in all the distance. So that's when I then went to the mall, because this was done way before Google's and YouTube's. So I went to the mall and see how did they do that commercially. And I noticed that they just use often ordinary thinner thread, and then they will have a longer stitch length. That's what I did, and that edge is holding fine together. So sometimes if you have this problem on those thin, loosely woven fabrics, you may want to just lengthen your stitch length. And also other tip, make your stitch width wider. I know the quick reference guide tells us to use 3.5, but if I make the stitch width wider, that way I'll have more fabric on that roll, so the seam will be a little bit more secure that way.
For my next rolled hem or rolled edge technique would be hemming of a sheer chiffon scarf or very sheer loosely woven fabric. This is a scarf that I had done long time ago, and when I made this one I had a little bit of a challenge at the time, because when I sewed it, and sometimes this can happen if you have a denser stitch, is that your fabric and your stitch will separate. And that was exactly what happened on this specific fabric. When I was stitching it, I noticed that my fabric and my seam was no longer together. Well, this was done like maybe 25 years ago. So those times there was no YouTube or Google or anything to find out, well, how would I do this one? So off to the mall I went, and I picked up a scarf that was store-bought, store-made, factory-made, and I said, well, how did they do that one? And I noticed that instead of using very dense stitching that I was going to use, actually I even put woolly nylon on it first. Sometimes they use just a very open stitch, because that very dense stitch, when I had my stitch length the shortest, and also I put my stitch width very narrow, so in that case I don't have much of a fabric in there, and this low stitches just perforated the edge. So then I went home and I put only serger thread on my serger, and just to lengthen the stitch length a little bit. My very first serger was a very basic one. I didn't even have the stitch width dial on it. My knife was always in the same position. Well, now I have a couple options that I can do. Well, first I'm going to lengthen the stitch length, and I'm going to put it all the way to 3. If I put longer than that one, the stitches may not look that good. And then but I'm still on the rolled hem side. And then I'm going to also make my stitch width a little bit wider. So instead of the normal 3.5, which is around that letter M, I'm going to go maybe 5 or the 4.5, somewhere a little bit wider. So I have a little bit more fabric on the fold. And then I have my differential feed at 0.8 because the fabric tends to pull a little bit. I could maybe even go to 0.6, but let's see how this little lightweight chiffon would work on with this setting. And I still have my ordinary Serger thread in the machine. So here's my stitch. So I did this one with the stitch width at almost 5, or maybe more like 4.5, and the stitch length at 3. So I have the stitches that will, the fabric is still wrapped around and my fabric is together. And also kind of nicer finish for this very sheer fabric rather than doing a very dense edge on it. So let's try on this fabric. This is just a little bit different kind of fabric. This is the one that when I was sewing on this direction earlier, it just perforated from the edge. But now see, everything's together. So that's just another technique when you are seaming or making a rolled edge on a really lightweight sheer, loosely woven fabric. This little flower, I had done this quite some time ago, but I had used nylon organza and I put very heavy thread, pearl crown rayon in an upper looper, but I did put the stitch length quite a bit longer on this one also, so there are little gaps between. But it made a quite pretty little rosette, little flower also, just putting it in one long edge on the rolled edge, and then other side I just used the 4-thread gathering, the 4-thread overlock and pull the gathers to make it into a little rosette. So just another way without using any of the wire in this case. I could have put the wire inside, little craft wire also, but because this fabric is a little bit more stiff, but also the thread is kind of heavy, so it has stayed very well during the years.
Well, now one of my favorites. I'm a Martha Pullen licensed alum teacher. Actually, I have total of 4 licenses, teaching licenses with Martha Pullen, basic teacher, alum sewing, and then 2 Serger licenses. So one of the big things with Martha Pullen is that lots of the techniques are to do with the alum sewing. Lots of christening gowns, lots of lace, all kinds of pretties. And I'll be showing a couple quilts and also christening gown that I had done in a Serger. I'll show little live videos on those ones. But one of the techniques that we often see on the alum sewing is to attach lace to fabric. In the traditional old times, this was done by hand, but we can also do this in a sewing machine, but it is so easy to do in a Serger. The trick on this one is that we are using the rolled edge stitch. Other option would be to use the 3-thread narrow hem. I often use the rolled edge. Either stitch would really be fine. And instead of having it a very short stitch length, I'm using 2 millimeters. That will just give me a nice strong seam, but it's not going to be too bulky for the delicate fabrics and the laces. I put the stitch width at M, which is recommended on that quick reference guide. And then I usually use my differential feed 0.8 because it's lighter weight fabrics. It just gives my fabric more taut and has a much flatter seam. And then of course stitch selector at D. But the trick on this one is that we're gonna put the lace and the fabric right sides together, but not right on the against edges on top of each other. We need to have the fabric edge, the raw edge, extending 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 inch. Really doesn't matter how much it extends, as long as it's more than 1/8 of an inch. Because we want this fabric edge, the raw edge, to be rolled, so that will be secure. But the lace doesn't have to be in a seam rolled, and actually would make it very bulky if that header was rolled there. All we want to have the stitch to go, the needle to go right on the header of the lace. Header of the lace is that heavier part of the lace. So I want to line up my lace over top of the fabric so that my fabric extends out, and then I will line up my needle to go right on the header. And when I sew and then I open it up, I'll press the seam towards the fabric and I have a pretty, very strong seam on that one. The feet, yeah, you could use your standard foot. In my live sample, I will be using the clear foot. Another really good one is a lace applicator, or you could also use the open toe foot. So all of those work great. Actually, I prefer some of these others than the standard foot. You can do the standard foot, it just doesn't have as good visibility.
Well, now I'm going to show some of those techniques that I had on the heirloom quilts and the christening gowns. And I laid 3 feet on my Serger. The standard foot would work also, but this is the time that I really like to have a little bit more visibility. Clear foot is one of my absolute favorites when I'm doing heirloom sewing. Other really great foot is the open toe foot, that we have the extra opening in the middle. So those ones will work great. I'm gonna put my trusted clear foot in the machine. And I just have a strip of eyelet, or in the heirloom sewing we call it embroidery. It's just a strip of pre-embroidered fabric. This could be just ordinary fabric also, but just had a little strip left, so I thought I'll use that one. And I'm looking the right side, so this one is the right side, so I'll put the right side up. And I have heirloom lace. Heirloom lace is 95% cotton, 5% nylon. So these ones can take a lot of heat and they don't yellow as much as the polyester or nylon laces. Often in a hands-on class, we just use the nylon lace for the exercise, but I'll use the real heirloom lace on this one. And I'm gonna give it a 3-second look, decide that's my right side. So I put the right sides together. So when I'm joining lace to fabric, instead of me putting these fabric edges right on top of each other, I'm gonna have this fabric edge to stick out a little bit. The reason for that one is that I need to have this fabric to roll so that it will be strong. Otherwise, it would not be strong enough seam. But also, the lace won't ravel, so I don't need it to roll and be bulky seam. So the lace, all I want to have is the needle to go on the header. And the header on the lace is that heavier part of the lace. So all I wanted to have just my needle to go there, and then my knife cuts excess fabric, and then it will roll this edge under. So I'm still at the rolled edge stitch, my stitch selector at D. I put the stitch length to 2, but it's still on the rolled hem side, and the stitch width is at M, which is the 3.5. And what I want to do on this case, and this is where really the clear foot is handy, because my right needle in the machine will be that first notch, and I even put a little darker mark on that position. I want that needle to go just on the header. So my edge of the fabric is sticking 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 inch. Really doesn't matter how much it sticks out, the knife will chop the rest of it out. And I'm just gonna lay it over so that I will see. Sorry, my head may be getting on the way to the camera. But I'm gonna have it so that that stitching would be just going over the lace. And I don't wanna stretch the lace. All I'm doing is just lay it on top. Another foot that you could also use is the lace applicator foot, like the name already says that. That definitely works great also. It has a little extra guide. So let me do this one. This way, this is just one of my favorite methods. Again, I'm not looking the needle, I'm looking the toe of the foot this time. And if I was doing this as a real heirloom project, I would put white thread in the Serger. But I left those colorful threads for the recording purposes so that you see the stitches better. But here I have attached the lace to the fabric. And when I press it, I will press it so that that seam is towards the fabric. And it is a very strong seam. I think the lace would fall apart before that fabric would give in, because the fabric edge has been rolled. Well, sometimes you may get a little sewing holiday. And as the Martha Pullen educators were teaching us in the class, if you have a sewing holiday, you'll take the fabric to the Holiday Inn. Meaning that if you missed a little bit, rather than going over with the Serger again, which makes it really bulky seamy, you just take it in a sewing machine and a matching thread, do a tiny little zigzag to catch that lace if the lace kind of went away a little bit. It's not a mistake, it's just a little holiday. So that is how we attach lace to fabric. Well, that is normally all we do in a machine class. But then when we do these actual project classes, I also show how do we gonna attach bridging or entredot into a piece of fabric. So I'm gonna do this on this sample so you get a little extra. So in this case, what I want to have is the stitch into my needle to go right along on that heavier part. And sometimes it is helpful if you even take a water-soluble hollow friction marker, even if you draw a little line on that one, might be easier to see, especially beginning. In this case, I will put these raw edges right on top of each other. And I want to have my needle to go just beside this heavier part. I don't want to go over that heavy part. It's kind of hard to sew and it makes the seam very, very bulky. So let me line up again on this one and try to, I'm looking on the angle, so it may not be perfect, but let's see how well I do in the angle here. And I didn't change any settings on my stitching. Oh, I can hear that I went too far over. Just it's not as easy to do in an angle that it would be normally. So this definitely wasn't my best sewing, because normally I don't sit on the side of the machine, I sit on top. So what I'll do, I just put my hand over the section that looked good. But you see, this one I went a little bit too far over, and I could feel that I was going over that heavier part. But this is what I'd like to have, so that I will just have that seam right beside that heavier embroidery part, and then I can weave ribbons on that bridging. Again, if you went too far away that you had just a cap of fabric, again, rather than sewing again with the serger, I would just put the stitch in the ditch foot in a machine or edge joining foot and go in a sewing machine and stitch right along on this line. So you can always have a little fix in a sewing machine rather than going over with the serger. So those were two very, very basic heirloom sewing techniques.
Well, continuing on some of these other heirloom techniques, serger tucks or decorative tucks, serger pintucks, different names for that one. We can do different kinds of pintucks in the serger also in the cover stitch side, but this is on the overlock side. And what we are using is really that same rolled edge stitch. But this time I put a little bit heavier, prettier thread in the loopers on these actual samples. The sample that I'll be doing in a live demo, I just use that serger thread. But whatever is on my upper looper, that is the thread I will see. Again, just depending on the look you want, you can have a shorter or longer stitch length. I had used some of these samples embroidery thread. The yellow one is actually 2 strands of Loriani thread on the upper looper. Gave a little bit heavier look because this fabric was a little bit heavier than the batiste. Well, there's a couple ways to do these serger pintucks or decorative tucks. Most examples or instructions, they will tell to fold the fabric wrong sides together and not to trim anything off. And it'll make really nice, dainty looking tuck. But then on the master pull and licensing classes that I have taken, they have another way to do it, which I find it much easier. And on that one, I still fold the fabric wrong sides together, but then I will trim off a tiny, tiny bit amount of the fold. Yes, I do cut the fabric, but it is all rolled under and it is a very strong seam. That way, then when I do the next row, all I have to do is fold the fabric a little bit further away than the width of my foot is, and then I just run the previous tuck against the left side of the foot, and I'll have those tucks perfectly lined up, perfectly parallel. So I don't need to pre-press every one of those lines ahead. So 2 ways to do it. I will demonstrate both of those on my sample. Again, you want to sew these tucks always in the same direction, because when you press them, you want to press them always so that the top side of the stitching is facing up. The top side of the rolled hem is always prettier than the underside. If you do these ones more into like a honeycomb look, when you pinch 2 of them tucks together, then the better stitch to use is the 3-thread narrow hem, because in that one both sides of the stitches are prettier. But if you just leave them as tucks, the rolled edge is a perfect stitch for that.
Well, how do we do those serger tucks, serger pintucks? There are a couple different ways to do that one. One of the ones that most commonly is told is that you will press lines wrong sides together on a fabric, give a little press or finger press. Fabric folding pen is a great way to do the presses. You just run a fabric folding pen over and then give a little finger press, and it will keep those edges nicely creased. Well, most instructions tell you not to trim anything off. And other ways to do what I'm going to show after. I'll do the first sample with that way, and then I show the way I learned on my multiple and licensing class. So this time, if I don't want to trim anything off, I can go all the way to the needle. So I lifted my pressure foot up, and I put this edge of the fabric right next to the knife. And I have those little guides also on my machine that helps me to keep it straight. So these little stickers are really handy. They are extra accessories that are sold in a shop, and I often use these as extra little guidance also. I have still my stitch at the rolled edge, and I have it the stitch length at 2. If I wanted these stitches to be a bit closer together, have a little bit more prominent looking kind of a tuck, I could put them closer together. And let me actually put it 1.5, so you'll see the colorful red thread more. Whatever is in the upper loop, you'd see the most. And I have my stitch width at M, and I have a differential feed at 0.8, keeping my fabric a bit more taut so it doesn't buckle so much. So I'm gonna sew without cutting anything off. Get pretty nice dainty looking pin tuck, and I often run it through my fingers to kind of smooth out those stitches. So that'll be my first pin tuck, and I would just press it towards the underside, because the underside of the rolled edge is never so pretty, because we have the lower loop kind of underneath as an extra bulk, and also that is where the fabric rolled over. So I would give a press it doing this way so it looks very pretty. Well, to do the second one, so this was my first pin tuck, and I started on the edge this way so that my shorter side was on the top, because if I sew them in the same direction, they will look, when I press them, they'll look prettier that way, because I can press them the same way. Well, the other technique is to have my fabric edge cut off a little bit. It will be kind of like a seam on an heirloom sewing, that it's going to be strong enough. But especially when you do multiple pin tucks, it's kind of handy because I don't have to mark them and press them separately. All I want to do is do a crease that is a little bit wider than my width of the foot. 4-thread sergers, you'll get to go a little bit narrower pin tucks because the foot is narrower, or narrow space in between. With the 8-thread sergers, they'll be a bit further apart. But that way, I will just run the left side of the foot against my previous tuck, and I have my knife to trim off a little bit. So this is kind of for me the easier way. It does make the seam a little bit bulkier, partly maybe because on this one I didn't run it right next to the knife. But again, just depending on look. I like doing the Martha Pullen way because it's just easier. I don't have to be so precise on lining my pre-marking all my tucks. I just do tuck at a time. Obviously, your fabric will shrink. So whenever you're creating an item with this one, you want to have your fabric quite a bit wider than needed, and create your tucks and then trim the fabric to size needed. So let me do one more tuck. Again, I just folded it. So that is a bit wider, a wider strip of fabric than my width of the foot. And I would use the left side of the foot as a guide. And if I had put pretty embroidery threads, some of those shiny threads or silk thread that I used on my quilt in there, they would look very pretty. This is just variegated Serger thread. But here, when I press these seams towards the dark, if I give a little bit of a starch or best press and press them, they'll look very pretty. And now to some of my very, very favorite Serger techniques. Heirloom quilting, heirloom sewing. So this little baby quilt has almost entirely been done in a Serger. Only time I used the sewing machine was for stitching the ditch in the quilting. But the entire quilt top and also the whole thing put together was done in a Serger. And we have done a class on this one in our shop also. But here is one example where I used the rolled edge, and just I used a fairly short stitch length on this one. I had silk thread in an upper loop, sewed those strips, and then they were woven on and attached onto the top fabric. Then some of the techniques I'll be showing later on are the Serger Pintucks. And that's again, I use that same silk thread, pretty much the same settings, and I sewed those little Pintucks. Then there's a breeching that has been attached using the rolled hem. And lace to fabric, those techniques really work great with the Serger. So all of the laces and the embroideries, little piece of a thread there, all of these ones have been joined together using the rolled edge stitch. So it can be used also as a stitch that is more construction stitching than decorative. And yes, this quilt has a ruffle at the edge, and the hem on it is done with that same silk thread with the rolled edge, and then I used the 4 thread together. There was, I think, like 6 or 8 strips of fabrics across the bolt. So without the Serger, I don't think I would have even attempted to do this ruffle. We had a baby quilt for the girl. Here's a baby quilt for the boy. Again, this is all done in a Serger, other than some of the quilting. Some of it has been done with my embroidery machine, and some with the stitch in the ditch. But again, on this one, if I go on to that center part, all of these sections, they've been sewn together using the rolled edge stitch. And here's some of those Serger Pintucks. The ribbons have been attached onto the fabric also with the rolled edge stitch. So this one again uses lots of the same stitch. There are lots of other techniques which I go through some of the other classes. And finally, a christening gown done all in a Serger. So this one uses the rolled edge stitch to attach the laces and embroideries and the silk ribbon, and of course all the side seams. So instead of using a French seam in a sewing machine, I have used the rolled edge. Another option would be to use the 3 thread narrow hem. And part of this one, there's also a baby bonnet and a little jacket. The jacket uses some of the cover stitches for quilting, but a lot of the construction has been done with the 3 thread rolled edge. So just some of the samples that I have done. I use the Serger a lot. I have 2 Martha Pullen Serger teaching licenses where some of these projects have come from.
Serger tassels. Wow, isn't this amazing? These ones are all just done using Serger thread. That tail, Serger tail that we run without any fabric, with the rolled edge stitch, it is a perfect one to make your own tassels or yarn. You could either use them to couch over in the sewing machine, or you can just to make them into tassels. And I have a couple pictures of a scarf and a bag that I have made using that way. You can also make curly ones. If I put on the lower loop, I will put a woolly nylon thread, and I pinch it a little bit to give extra tension. And whenever I'm finished sewing, that woolly nylon will relax, and I will get little curly ones. I can also put the little beads in a fishing line and search them over. I'll do a totally other demo on that one of these days. I'm not going to do that part of this class. This class is getting long enough without it. But then this one, in this little purple one, I have used wire candlelight thread in the upper looper, and I used the elastic foot. And I put the fishing line inside on that foot, so there's a little fishing line inside this one. It just gives me a little bit more body for the tassel or the yarn, depending on how I want to do that one. Other options what I can also do is I can, instead of using the rolled edge, I can always use the 3 thread wide or narrow overlock, sew them over a little seam binding, and create little trims that way. I'll show those in a live video. One little tip, that if you're searching a really, really long tail, if you turn your Serger other way around, or like a sit behind the Serger, and then it's easier to kind of roll that tail while you're stitching, because it's kind of otherwise going to piles behind the fabric, behind the machine. And if I don't roll it into a roll, especially long tail, it kind of gets tangled up.
Well, what else can we do with the rolled edge stitch? Well, we can make our own tassels and trims. And here's a really great book by Emma Seabrook, and where she is describing all kinds of different ways to use decorative threads to make your own trims. I've used these quite a bit in the past. On this little bag, there's some of the tassels on this one, so I will put little beads on the edge on those ones to give a little weight on the tassels. And here's some of the cold metallic thread, a little heavier thread, a little tassel. And then I have a scarf, and on the edge of the scarf I have these tassels that I use the pearl crown rayon. So all of this one is this Serger tail, that when we stitch, we'll get the tail and just wrap it onto a spool or a little cardboard, and then you have a pretty trim that you can either make into a tassel or apply later on a garment. You could just couch it onto a garment, and there are lots of examples on this book how these were used. So great way to just make your own trims. And there's one example that you may want to wrap them in a spool, otherwise they end up in a bit of a lump on there. If you want a little bit more body for the tassel or this yarn, on this one I had used a fishing line. So I put the elastic foot in the machine, put the fishing line, and then sewed over. So that gives a little bit more body for the tassel on that one. And then if you want to have curly ones, at the shop I have a little angel, that the angel hair is done just using the Serger tails. How I made this curly was that on the lower looper I put woolly nylon, and this time it needs to be woolly nylon, not the poly yarn. Woolly nylon is the most stretchy one on those kind of a fuzzy texturized nylon threads. Upper looper I had put pearl crown rayon, needle was only thread. Well, in order to get this kind of curly, I held back a little bit on that looper thread. I literally just pinched the thread on the top of my machine a little bit to give a little extra tension. And then when I let them sit for a little while, they all curled up. You can also attach beads. So on this one, there are beads done on, put on a fishing line first, and then serged over. And there's plenty beads on here, so you can also attach beads into the yarn. But then, just like on this Emma Seabrook book, these are then done by using just an ordinary 3-thread overlock instead of the rolled edge. So on this one I had put this heavier blue thread in the upper looper, and then on my needle and the lower looper were just embroidery threads. And I serged this one over this very, very thin stay tape. So it just literally just have your stay tape to kind of wrap inside. That gives a little body for this this trim that I could then apply for a garment or a home decor item. But as you're gonna see that started from this this kind of one. Or this one I was just one time, this is a really long time ago, I was playing. I used a little bit heavier material, and I sewed it first on one side and then I serged the other side so I could attach this one onto a item as my own trim. I didn't use very pretty thread on this sample. It was just, I think, woolly nylon that I used, but if I put pretty thread in there I could make really nice looking trims myself. So just playing with the threads. So either to use the rolled edge stitch like some of the tassels, or then you can use the 3-thread overlock, wide or narrow, and sew over a little thin tape.
Well, there's one more 3-thread Flatlock Narrow that I cover on this class. When I do this class on the shop, often I just mention this one, since more on the Flatlock techniques are done on number 3 class. And most times I use the 2-thread flatlock, but we also have a 3-thread flatlock in the machine. And it is very easy to go from the 3-thread rolled edge to this stitch. We don't need to do too many changes in the machine. So I'll do a little demo on this, on a live demo up in the end of this class, but then really most of those flatlock techniques I will be covering on the number 3 Serger class. So to change from the rolled edge, we still have the same needle in a machine, but the stitch length, now we need to go to the standard side, no longer the rolled edge side. So there's no letter R behind that numbers. And again, depending on how close you want those stitches to be, you set your stitch length. The width, they have a very narrow width on this one. On my sample, I'm gonna put it all the way to 5 millimeters to as wide as possible, because I'm gonna use this stitch sewing 2 pieces of fabric together. Stitch selector is still at D as we had on the rolled edge, and rest of these settings are exactly the same as with the rolled edge. So we just had to change the stitch length from the rolled edge side to the standard side. But then let's go to the threading. Here is a big change, because if I now sewed with these settings, the stitch, it wouldn't be a flat lock. My needle threads wouldn't be loose like this one. On this stitch, we need to have these needle threads to be long, very loose. On a manual tension machines, I would loosen my needle tension to almost nothing. We don't have tensions, we have automatic thread delivery. So in this case, we're gonna have our needle thread to go in the same position as my upper loop, so I get the same amount of thread. So I need to move the needle thread from the second slot to the third. That's why it's important always to go through the checklist and then the threading. So that is important part. And again, that's the reason why they didn't put in the factory that saying this is on left needle, right needle, upper loop, or lower loop, because the threads don't always go in the same spot. So this stitch can be used as a construction seam or as a decorative seam. It also has two right sides, either the ladder side, which is the needle threads, or the serpentine side, that is the looper thread. In this case, it's the upper looper. The lower looper ends up being just a straight line, right kind of edge of the fabric. This is still an overlock stitch, which means I need to sew this one, 2 fabrics together over an edge. So on the sample that I do in my live video, I'll be sewing 2 fabrics that I will put wrong sides together. So I'll get my upper looper thread sewn on the right side. If I put my right sides together, then I will get my needle threads to be on the right side. So on this one, because I sewed 2 pieces of fabric together, I did also engage my knife. When I looked at the quick reference guide, they tell you to lock the knife. I do not believe that one. So engage the knife, especially if you're trimming something off. If you do it as a decorative stitch when you are not even going close to the edge of it, then you could definitely lock the knife. It really wouldn't matter if you lock it or not. Most times I leave the knife up. So I don't always believe the quick reference guide exactly. And that is one of those times. So I will do a little live demo, but there's going to be a lot more flatlock techniques on the number 3 class. So this one, I just do a very quick one, but then real techniques, which doesn't matter whether I use a 2-thread or 3-thread flatlock. So thank you so much for participating and happy searching.
Okay, now we have gone through 4 different 3-thread techniques on this class. We started from the overlock wide, then overlock narrow, then we did the narrow hem, and finally the rolled edge. There is one more 3-thread technique, which is the 3-thread flatlock narrow. There are also a couple other flatlock stitches on that same page, but these are for 2 threads. That is what we go through on the number 3 class. But the 3-thread flatlock narrow is a stitch I don't use very often because it really creates almost the same effect as the 2-thread flatlock narrow. Only difference on these ones is that on a 3-thread we also have the lower looper that makes a little straight line on the right side of the fabric edge. When on this one, only thing we have is the needle and the lower looper. But so the lower looper shows on this stitch on top on this kind of like a serpentine look. And on the flatlock narrow and the 3-thread, the upper looper is shown on top and the lower looper is a straight line. Underside, they look exactly the same. There's no difference between the needle threads, are always the same. Well, I don't use the 3-thread flatlock very often, But because it's very simple to go from the current settings to this one, I will demo this one too. In a class, when we do this on a hands-on class in a shop, very often we don't even have time to do that one. I usually end up just talking about it a bit, but I'll have time in here, so I'm gonna show it also. Pretty simple to go from the rolled edge to this setting. The needle is exactly the same as we have, which is the O2 or right needle in a machine, but stitch length. Again, there's a range, but more importantly, there is no letter R behind, which means I need to go to the standard side of the knob. The larger knob, I'll go past the 0, and let me go to about 3. I'm gonna put halfway between. Again, I can use the entire range. The width, they give a fairly narrow width on this one. I'm gonna go a bit wider. I'll go all the way the widest, that is 5, because we can use any setting on it. Stitch selector, that one is still at D because I was using the rolled edge. Rest of the settings are the same, other than they mention here that lock the blade. Do not lock the blade on this sample that I'm doing. Depending what we do with this stitch, you can also do some with the locked. But I'm gonna join 2 pieces of fabric together, so I do want to have my blade up. I want to have it cut in, so I won't believe that one. I don't believe it on this one either. Then for the threading, so after anytime when we change stitches, we want to go through the checklist first and then the threading. Well, threading, the lower looper and the upper looper still go exactly the same spots that they were currently on the last stitch we did. But the needle thread has moved. Instead of being on that second slot from the left, it has moved to the third. It is sharing the same path with my upper looper thread. And why is that? Well, to do the flat lock stitch, so that we can pull the stitch all flat, as the name says, we need to have plenty needle threads. If I had a manual tension machine, I would have to loosen that needle thread tension to almost nothing to get this effect. On our machine, no tensions, no tension dials. So all we have to do is thread the machine or code in the picture, do the settings and thread the machine, and we're ready to go. So I need to move that needle thread from this slot to this slot. I could just cut the threads and then move it there, but there's an easier way to do. I'm gonna lift the pressure foot up and I'm just gonna move it there. But now I'm running into a problem. This thread is stuck on the back plate in here, the little way it snaps in place, so that will keep the thread in the thread delivery area. So let me pull this thread loose a bit so I can pull it up this far, but it's stuck there. Well, how do I get it unstuck? Is I'll take that, I'm going to keep my hands away, take the there's this needle thread, I'm going to take it and make it on a loop behind the machine, and I'm going to snap it again on that same slot. There you go, it'll snap. And then I'm going to pull that thread towards me, and it gets released from that little snap on the back. And now I can move this thread to share the same path with the upper looper. Again, have to remember to hear that little snap, because if it doesn't snap, then the thread may not stay inside the thread delivery area. So what I did was, first I lifted my pressure foot up so that all these gates opened on the thread delivery area, and then I took the thread, made a little loop in the back, and I just got a little twisty on my thread. There we go. Make a little loop behind, snapped it, pulled it towards me, and then I can rethread that one as needed. And I may have to just pull this one out of the way, getting all twisted. I'm gonna catch it in on there, snap it in place, and let me pull that needle thread out of the way a bit, because I just was pulling it so many times it got a bit twisted. There we go. So now I'm all ready to go. So that's all I had to do on the go from the 3-thread rolled edge to 3-thread flat lock. Well, this stitch can be used as a decorative stitch or as a construction seam. So I have 2 pieces of a cotton fabric. If I put wrong sides together, I will have my looper threads to be showing on the top side. If I want my needle threads to be on the top side, because I could weave ribbons, then I would put my right sides together. So this stitch has 2 right sides. So I'm gonna leave the looper threads because I have a prettier looper threads at the moment. I have those variegated threads. So I will leave those ones on the top side. So, and that's the reason I want to have my knife blade up so that it is cutting, because I want to cut the edge of the fabric a little bit. Also, that is the reason why I made my stitch width wider, because this is a woven fabric. So I want to have a little bit more fabric on the fold so that my seam will be strong enough. Now here is my flatlock seam. At the moment, it doesn't look like a flatlock, looks like just ordinary 3-thread overlock. But what I see on this, on the top side, I have the upper looper thread, that was a pink thread. Underside, I have my needle thread, that was that dark gray thread. The lower looper, all it is a straight line on here on the edge of the fabric. So when I pull this flat, that's why it's called a flat lock. My needle threads had those loose stitches, so now I have the needle threads in here that if I use this as the right side, I could weave ribbons on it, but this side looks like I sewed the stitch right in the middle. But it is an overlock stitch, so we had to sew it at the edge. So that finishes all my 3-thread techniques. Yes, there are some more 3-thread techniques in the machine, all the wave stitches. I leave that one for the number 3 class, only because on the number 3 is really kind of a catch-all on all the remaining stitches, mainly to the 2-thread stitches, but also then I do some 4-thread techniques and the wave stitch. So that'll be my next class. Thank you very much.